Started with a video from Senator Amy Klobuchar commenting on this issue. She's not able to be here tonight, but sends her regards. Thanks for coming.
Hello to all my friends at the U of M Law School and the Humphrey School for Public Affairs. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm always excited to hear that we have so many students interested in antitrust and competition that we're making it cool again. That's why I wear this, kind of more fun, you know. We need more of you. After decades of being the province of economists and number crunchers, antitrust is getting its mojo back. Why? Well, it is no secret that our country has a competition problem. That's why restoring competition in our economy has always been a top priority. It's so important to me that I even wrote a book on it. You know, here's a funny story. My book actually came out around the same time as Pete Buttigieg's book, right after the presidential election. Now, you may remember that Pete and I had kind of a rivalry during the presidential campaign. I just want everyone to know that we are actually good friends. Although I will note that right after that campaign ended, Pete put out a New York Times bestselling book called Trust. Not to be outdone, 8 months later, I put out my own New York Times bestselling book called Antitrust. So why did I pick that topic? Because whether you're a small business owner forking your hard-earned profits over to Amazon to get a decent spot in search results, an independent app developer forced to pay 30% of your revenue to Apple or Google for their privilege of being in one of their app stores, or a fan who had to pay high fees for bad service in order to see their favorite musician, monopoly power touches all of our lives. And after years of questionable Supreme Court decisions and congressional reluctance to adequately fund federal antitrust enforcers, our antitrust laws and institutions have struggled to protect competition and stem the rampant growth of monopoly power, because when you starve them to death, well, how are they going to take on the biggest companies the world has ever known? The American economy cannot thrive without open, competitive markets. That means we have to boost competition, from telecom to ticketing, from big pharma to big tech. While digital markets may be new, the fight for fair competition is as old as America itself. It's a fight to live up to the vision of economic freedom put forth by the colonists who dumped all that tea into the Boston Harbor to show that they wouldn't be forced to buy tea from a bloated British monopoly like the East India Company. Because as Adam Smith, the godfather of capitalism, said, the invisible hand of competition is the key to a strong capitalist economy. But only, people don't always realize he says this, but only if we have a government that effectively takes on the, quote, overgrown standing army, those are his words, of monopolists. That's why throughout history, Congress has come together and rejuvenated our antitrust laws by making sure that there's a check on monopolies. And it's why we're now seeing important antitrust actions, including a recent victory in a major suit against Google by the Antitrust Division and state attorneys general, including ours, in addition to a government suit against Apple seeking to break its stranglehold over the smartphone market. That's not to mention private antitrust cases challenging Google and Apple and how they operate the app stores, one of which resulted in a historic victory before a jury, leading the judge to say he'll tear the barriers down on Google's app store monopoly. Music to my ears. While these cases are an excellent start, they can take us only so far, and that's why Congress must act again to rein in monopoly power. We've got to make our laws as sophisticated as the markets that they're governing. I see three main avenues for action. First, we need to ensure antitrust laws as a whole are sophisticated, because these monopolists are pretty smart and they have tons of money. That's why I lead comprehensive legislation to update our antitrust standards for the 21st century, give our enforcers the tools they need to stop harmful consolidation, improve enforcement against exclusionary conduct, and make it easier to look back at past mergers that have ended up raising serious competition issues. Ticketmaster Live Nation, just a little spoiler alert. My bill would overturn problematic Supreme Court case law like Trinco, Brook Group, and Ohio v. American Express, which has hampered enforcement against dominant firms, and it would inject significant additional funding into the Antitrust Division and the FTC. The time to do something is now. Many of our peer nations have already taken action. If we want America to continue to lead the global economy, we should be putting forth rules and regulations in a uniquely American way, not relying on other countries. Second, we have to ensure our antitrust enforcers at the DOJ and the FTC have the staffing and resources they need to do their jobs. We have had some important victories recently. Notably, my legislation that I lead with Republican Senator Chuck Grassley to update merger fees for the first time in 20 years was signed into law. The updated fee structure means our antitrust agencies have more resources to hire lawyers, economists, maybe even some of you, to take on the biggest, most complicated antitrust cases. We also passed legislation I led with Republican Senator Mike Lee to ensure state enforcers can keep their enforcement actions in the courts that they choose, avoiding wasteful, time-consuming venue transfers and consolidations with private lawsuits. Our bill was supported by nearly every AG in the country, including Minnesota's own Keith Ellison. And the legislation is why there is a trial challenging Google's advertising monopoly in Virginia's Rocket Docket rather than bogged down with private cases in New York or California. When you have everyone from Mike Lee to Keith Ellison on the same page, that's a good sign. It means leaders from both sides of the aisle agree that the time is now to rein in monopoly power, particularly when it comes to big tech. Third, despite recent successes in court, we still need to pass legislation to update our antitrust laws for digital markets. Today, you're going to hear how the two dominant app stores have harmed competition, raised prices, and deterred small businesses from innovating and competing with big tech titans. We all know that Apple controls 100% of app distribution for iPhones, and every single Android phone is required to have the Google Play Store. On top of that, Google controls nearly 90% of all online searches, and Apple controls 65% of all smartphones. These companies use their dominance as digital gatekeepers to siphon profits and stop disruptive innovation from the companies they rely on from their platforms to reach consumers. It's a great business model for big tech and a bad business model for everyone else. That's why Senator Grassley and I are working on legislation to take on anti-competitive self-preferencing and create a more level playing field in our digital markets. It passed the Senate Judiciary Committee on a bipartisan basis, making it the first tech competition bill voted out of the committee since the dawn of the internet. I'm also working across the aisle with Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn on legislation to establish new rules for app stores. Specifically, it will protect app developers' right to offer competitive pricing, ensure developers can tell consumers about lower prices, and give consumers more control over their devices. It would boost competition by requiring gatekeeper platforms to give independent third-party app developers fair access to features, software, and their own data, and ensure small businesses can innovate and compete without fear that a dominant platform will charge outrageous fees and even steal their businesses and customers. These bills ensure that platforms can protect the privacy and security of consumers' data and devices. The work's even more important now with the rise of AI-enabled applications. We all know AI brings both opportunity and certainty, and some uncertainty. I think David Brooks put it well when he wrote, "The people in AI seem to be experiencing radically different brain states all at once. I found it incredibly hard to write about AI," he said, "because it is literally unknowable whether this technology is leading us to heaven or hell. We need guardrails in place that acknowledge it can be both. That includes looking out for anti-competitive behavior all the way down the AI supply chain. That's good for consumers and innovation, and it's also critical for maintaining U.S. economic competitiveness. Yes, we have a lot of work to do, but I know we can do it. America has a long history of fighting monopoly power, and I know you're all committed to doing exactly that. I feel clear-eyed optimism because I know you have the creativity and ingenuity it takes to forge a future where businesses of all sizes can thrive. Thank you. Enjoy today's discussion.
Thank you to Senator Klobuchar and her staff for sharing that with us. I want to introduce our panelists and our moderator for the night and welcome them. Paul Valor, law professor, or UMN professor, John and Bruce Moody chair in law and business. Dustin Brusnak, did I get that right? CEO of Modern Logic. Sherman Bosch, CEO of Caption. And Wade Beavers, partner in Skoll Ventures. And please help me welcome our moderator for the night, Professor Larry Jacobs, Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks you all for joining us. We're now going to have this conversation. We're fortunate to have a terrific panel of doers. Paul and I are the talkers and the analysts and the scholars, but we've got a bunch of doers here, so that's going to be fun. Paul, let me start with you. You can hear Senator Klobuchar in her excellent introduction gearing us up to talk about the evils of Google and Amazon and Apple. What about their benefits? Just before let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, let's start with quantity, as I think it was Lenin, not John. The other one said quantity has a quality all its own. And the kind of companies we're talking about here in terms of market cap, Larry, are over $1 trillion. Google and Amazon and Apple and NVIDIA. We also, almost every one of the companies that Senator Klobuchar mentioned. So these are large on scales that I think it's just really hard to get your head around. But the second thing I want to emphasize about them is this is recent. These are companies that if we were here with our parents, we'd be talking about gritty little startups. It's only 30 years ago, I think it's 1994, that Amazon was founded. Jeff Bezos selling some books to a few people, and I'm sure Barnes & Noble didn't think much of them then. Or I think it was 1997 or 98 when Larry Page and Sergey Brin on the campus at Stanford founded this little company that would help you with search engines. And even Apple, which has been around since the 1970s, was in a rebirth in the mid-1990s. John Sculley had just left. He tried to sell computers the way he sold soda pop. And we were about 2 or 3 years away from the return of Steve Jobs and the dawn of the smartphone. He spent about $150 million, a precious money to do that, and guessed right. So these are gritty companies. These are companies that have gotten very large, or large again very soon. And so when we talk about them as dominance, let's remember, this is very recent. These are companies that have made big bets and they've won. And they're getting a return on what those bets are. And the real challenge from them, at least from my standpoint, Larry, with antitrust is to do 4 things. It's first to provide a source of innovation for our country and the like. It's to provide a fair return to the investments and risks that they made. It's to provide a kind of contestable market for rivals that go with this thing. And then I think at the end of the day, it's to provide a guide for other companies that come along the way. NVIDIA is the other big company. We wouldn't even know what they were 3-4 years ago. So there's several reasons for us to be thinking in this context about these companies that have gotten big so recently and are so influential as we think about antitrust policy.
Thank you very much. Wade, we just heard Paul talk about the tremendous innovation in a short period of time. And of course, we're talking about the gatekeepers in terms of digital. What does that mean in terms of innovation?
Well, it even goes back to Microsoft. We could bring that in, who everybody's aware of that. But Microsoft was sued and lost in those cases. Remember Netscape. So this is, even though it's new, it is old in reality. And the fine line is, with innovation, these companies, they can innovate super fast, but they reach a threshold of size where their innovation becomes a way to have protectionism, right? And the reality is, I myself, starting Duop, we had 3 of the first 500 apps ever delivered in the Apple App Store. And I can tell you what it was like in the infancy. It was crazy. And they didn't have a lot of structure in place, but they had a lot of arbitrary decisions they would make on what they would accept and not accept. And the hard part with that is, as a young company developing, you're really on a bootstrap budget. So the challenge is, you're creating this app front or this ability for new companies to come along, but they randomly would just stifle. I mean, we had an app rejected called Whoopee Cushion. You can laugh, but the reality was they held it for 6 months. And as a result, it got some PR, was in Bloomberg Magazine and other things, but then the problem was, then there were 30 other people that emulated what we did, and by the time it got to market, we were now competing with 30. We were not first to market, which we would have been at that time. The cost was, I can tell you, in the millions, because the one that did win in that battle generated $1 million, $1.5 million, which for a small company is pretty big.
Dustin, what has your experience been in terms of these app platforms and your efforts to create and innovate?
So we have built, I think, 100+ mobile apps with various different companies, and I'd say about half of them have been stifled in some way by the App Store environment. We collected thousands, literally thousands of rejections from the App Store, some for really specious reasons. So for example, we had a grocery app that got rejected because we were asking for the user's age, because we needed to know that because the grocery sold some age-restricted products, and Apple just decided, hey, we're going to enforce that rule for you, even though we're not going to enforce it for other grocery apps that are maybe a little bit bigger, that are run by big names. So I think, yes, these companies have done great things. They've given us great platforms. But to your point, I think we have to understand that in the environment that they came out of, in the garage, I don't think they would have been as successful, given they didn't have the walled gardens that we have now, right? They didn't have the level of monopoly control. And every time we put an app out, when I'm talking to young entrepreneurs or companies that are starting an app, I have to coach them through, okay, we are going to have to spend an extra month getting through the App Store rejection period. You're going to be rejected multiple times. Another good example is we don't release in the December period, because in the December period, the App Store rules, people who monitor that, change out while other people are on vacation. And suddenly we are being removed from the App Store or threatened to be removed from the App Store for things that have been in our application for 3, 4, 5 years. And so the dynamic of starting a software business on a shoestring budget, and then you have a big company say, okay, we are going to not only limit your time, we're going to make it harder to get in, we're going to apply the rules in ways that you cannot predict, and then on top of it, we're going to take 30% of your revenue, which is absurd. There are very few businesses that can survive when you subtract that much revenue from their top line and have any sort of returns. Apple itself does not have to pay a tax to perform in their own environment. Why should we have to do that? Especially when you're talking about the two between Apple and Android, the modern computing platform that the vast majority of the people on Earth use as their primary platform for computing.
Sherman, we've been talking about the impact of Google and Apple in terms of their control over the digital platforms. And the way they're constraining innovation by the companies. What does that mean for the consumer? What is it that the consumer may be losing? Or maybe you'd say, well, if it's not these two guys, there'll be some other company that'll come along with something similar or maybe even better than what they've had. What does this mean for the consumer?
God, that's a great question. And thanks for having us here. Thanks for hosting this conversation. I actually have to start from a different place. I have to start from gratitude. Because for me, 30 years ago, before these phones existed, the thing that I do, the thing that Caption does, isn't possible. And so there's a level of what you were talking about, these new companies that created this innovation, and to some degree they should be rewarded for it. Now, I was born with low vision, and so I've never been able to do what I can do today with a smartphone. In a lot of cases, I think about the smartphone less as a phone and an app as more as a prosthetic, right? As a device that helps me read things I couldn't read, see things I couldn't see, hear things I couldn't hear. And so it's a tough balance, and I find that I'm both angry and excited at the same time, because I hear the stories of the first apps and stories of apps being fought, and I'm living that as a company owner myself, where Apple might be arbitrary, or they might say something like, you now have to do this where you didn't before. But I think for consumers, I would have to ask the question, maybe to you in the group, is what are we missing because Apple is doing this? A friend of mine who works for a company and couldn't be on this panel because he would be afraid to be on here and tell his story, sent me an email and he said, if the web browser were invented today, it would not pass Apple's guidelines. And so think about that for a minute, right? If Netscape were released today, Apple would have rejected it. And what was Netscape like? What was Chrome like? So I think on one part for a consumer, you say, well, if I have access to it, then I don't worry about it anymore, right? It maybe doesn't matter to them, frankly, because they have their phones and they have their apps, and they moved from, I mean, I'm part of the Instagram generation, my mom is in the Facebook generation, and my son is in the TikTok generation. Like, so maybe they don't care. But my question back to the group is, what are we missing because of that?
Let me bring Paul in, and then we'll come to Wade. Paul, did you want to weigh in? How should we be thinking about innovation and the loss of innovation?
So I think we have to think a little differently in these kinds of industries. I guess the term you'd use in the scholarship would be dynamically competitive industries. What does that mean? It means that they're not necessarily competition in the market. They're competition for the market. I tell my students, think of the third most popular railroad gauge or the third most popular word processing software. Yeah. Nobody knows it because it doesn't exist. And so that's what dynamic competition is about. There's big investments in R&D. Somebody wins the standards game, and then the contestability, Larry. What I'd want to have is I'd want to have a platform that was more conducive to essentially others being able to use it. Like, think of, again, the railroad tracks. It doesn't mean that there's only one railroad. We regulate it, and what we want is we want multiple railroads to compete and pay the owner of the tracks a fair return, and if they can do it proprietarily, great. So creating some public aspects that makes the technology and apps contestable, that's what we want for more consumer choice.
I've got a question for you. So to some extent, what we're talking about here is government power and market power. And what I hear you saying is the app platform ought to be a public utility. And so it concerns me, not because I'm inherently against it, but because of the consequences it would mean for the market dynamism that you just described.
Right. I'm coming from the Carlson School today, so you're not going to brand me as a dangerous socialist here on this. That's moreover happens at this school, Larry. But what I think it means is we provide, by providing access, there's nothing that's in the way of appropriating somebody else's rights. It's about making markets contestable. It's the same reason, for example, that we make markets contestable in other areas, like the airlines industry. We try to let other people kind of come if they want to fly to Minneapolis, they can. Now, they've got challenges, don't get me wrong, but as a matter, think back 40, 50 years ago when the Civil Aeronautics Board said we only need 2 airlines or 3 airlines to fly to Minneapolis. We can do that and not upset contract and property rights.
Yeah, but I mean, those of us who know something about airlines know that, yes, we don't have the aeronautics board anymore, and as a result, prices fell and traffic increased. But there's a whole lot of regulation in there. There's a whole lot of kind of market minding by government. And I guess the question that I'm asking you flat out is that what you're suggesting, that we need government to kind of come in here and create a kind of public platform? Because what I'm hearing our 3 gentlemen here talking about is the lack of access, the unfairness, the kind of exploitation of monopoly power.
Right. So there are different ways to deal with that. You want government to get involved. Think of Ida Tarbell and Standard Oil, right? We can break it up, and what we find, as we found from the trial judge back in Microsoft back in the late 1990s, he wanted to break up the company. Maybe it would have made it more valuable. We've talked about breaking up Google. I'm talking about a more light-handed form of regulation, one that uses and harnesses the competitive juices of app producers like the ones we have right here, as opposed to busting it all up and burning it all down.
No, okay, Wade?
But let's talk about, on your computer right now, you can buy software and put it on the product you've bought, right? But in the mobile space, you don't have that luxury. So the rules have changed, whether that's some form of government regulation or the fact that Apple, who provides the tools, and as a developer, we pay a fee to develop into that market. But then we're told we're going to review it. And oh, by the way, if your product's good enough and we've got the data and we know enough about it, we might put that product in our operating system. They have a unfair advantage that's dramatic because I don't know that data. I don't know you can compare it. If you don't believe that, just look at Dark Sky, which was a weather app they bought for probably pennies on the dollar, because Dark Sky at that point needed the money, and then turn around and put it in their OS, which killed other weather apps, mind you, but they also just took a few functions out of it. And for them, that's a pittance. And if you don't believe that, think about all the big companies, because I know I've gone against it. Apple has more IP, and if I suddenly say, hey, I've got a patent with that, they'll just drop open and say, I've got 50 that you're infringing on. That's a challenge.
Paul, let's get Dustin in here.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is innovation in the available markets. We don't have that with platform threats. So what we talk about when we do advising is what I call platform threats. So the idea is, can you choose and build on top of one platform or another platform, each platform giving you different competitive advantages, access to different markets? With in particular, the app stores, we have two platforms that control 100% of the market. So like the PC you can install software on, like the internet where you can go and open your browser and buy from any business that you want, you don't have that. If you are a consumer of Apple, you have the App Store, you buy from the App Store, and Apple gets their 30% tax. And so it's very different. I think you do want these big companies to make capital investments in things like hardware R&D, right, where it's really, really expensive to build something new. But once the consumer gets that in their hands, you can't have the titans own both the hardware and the software and the consumer relationship 100% all the way through without stifling an absurd amount of innovation, right? Like when you develop for these platforms, it almost feels like you're a serf. You're basically strengthening the competitive advantage of the phone for very, very little advantage yourself, right? And those success stories that you hear about the apps that make millions of dollars behind the scenes, or billions of dollars, they're all paying the App Store tax, they're all kissing the ring. And if you don't kiss the ring while you're off the platform, and Apple has a long history of kicking people who have successful business off their platform, or even worse, stealing their ideas, the best ideas they have, building them into their OS, and crushing the company for no real reason.
You know, network dominators have never been philanthropic.
That's true.
Whether they're in the app business or they're in railroads or they're in telecoms. But we know how to do this. We know how to take one or two large networks and make them contestable. We know how to set or nudge those incumbents to figure out in their own enlightened interest how they get more rent from all of you using this and give way where you've got a better idea. They just sometimes need a little nudging because that's not what they like to do if their shareholders don't.
Paul, do you have a great example of this contestable competition?
In the consumer space, please, because the railroad, I think, is...
Telecoms is a great example for that. In many ways, it was about providing other telecoms to come in with an AT&T that was deregulated and bust up. Or we go across the pond to the UK throughout the 1980s, telecoms, electricity, coal, all the network industries that are really key to this, trains and airplanes. All of them saw there were networks that were considered to be natural monopolies, but with the right kind of light regulatory touch, with people who know the industry and people who are interested in promoting contestability, it's doable. How do we do it here? I'm not the right guy to do it, but there are smart people, in particular smart people working for the Biden administration who do.
Sherman, let me ask you a question. The idea of the market is a famous description of it, exit and voice. If you're in the market and you're a consumer and you want an iPhone that's got X, Y, and Z capabilities, you go buy it. Mm-hmm. If you don't like what's being offered, you leave and you go somewhere else. And now we have 2 or 3 options in the U.S. We've got options abroad. Why not rely just on that market system? That if we don't like the apps that are being offered, that the consumer can go somewhere else to get these terrific apps with these innovative features that you all have been developing. Won't that work? Why not just rely on the consumer exiting?
I don't have a great answer for that. And the reason why is because I believe the technology has moved from innovation to novelty to ubiquity. And so we reach a point in which, you have a smartphone, and if you don't have a smartphone that's the same as part of this ecosystem, then you do miss out on some of that connection. One example of that is the chat bubble, right? There's an argument going on right now with the green versus the blue chat bubble. Who here's green and who here's blue, right? And status to a degree. And for me, maybe as a Gen Xer, I don't care as much, but I do know some kids that care a lot. And so participating in this larger thing is, sure, it's a market choice. You can choose not to have an iPhone. You can choose not to do that. If that's the only way to achieve a thing, then that choice becomes harder because you're choosing to not participate or participate. And that strikes, I think, at the heart of the human condition, which is a different story.
Wade, you're looking skeptical.
Yeah, because I don't think we have consumer choice, because the reality is, and I've lived this, BlackBerry had 68% of the market share when we got into the business. It would have been really tough to compete. Apple, it flipped in 12 to 18 months. It just flipped, right? And, you know, BlackBerry probably was too confident in their little click. The reality is we're kind of down to 2 OSs in the reality, because Microsoft even tried to get in the space and they couldn't. And they're a big player, right? We're down to 2, and so you say the consumer, you know, why don't you just wait for them to go buy another phone? Well, the problem is you're all on a platform that you've probably been on for a long time, because the switch rate is really expensive. And I think that's the hard part. And I also believe that the way Apple holds it, and even Google for that matter, when you look at the storefront, they restrict you as a consumer, because if you want to get your Kindle book and just buy it really quick, you can't buy it in the app. You have to go to a website to get it. And they're competing even against Amazon, which is a big player, right? But they can all kind of fight each other and say, hey, I got this IP, you got this IP. They're at the table to have some negotiation. And really, it just limits the ability for mid to small businesses to innovate and bring that forward. And really, the biggest sufferer is the consumer.
I'm glad you brought up patents, by the way, because patent thickets are a problem for innovators when they run into a wall of patents that are held by incumbents who come after them for treble damages and attorney's fees. But one of the problems, I think, in the apps business is patenting is either non-existent or it's not worth it. Many of them are so-called business methods, which was a form of innovation that only became patentable in the mid-1990s, and then about 15 years later, the Supreme Court took an interest, meaning they decided that we were going to radically narrow this. So patent protection for apps is, I think, on a best day, it's inadequate. Copyright is inadequate.
We spent over $1 million in patent protection, and it got us nowhere. Yeah. It actually ended us, in the case of Apple, just threw out 15 other ones at us. And we were like, wow, okay, well, we're not going to win.
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario
Let me just
for
bring
me.
Dustin in here. Go ahead, Dustin.
Yeah, so patents, I think, yes, and patenting software, like as a software developer, is inherent net negative the way the patent system works now. Because what happens is you have companies like Microsoft, and I'm a former employee of Adobe Systems, right? And what we would do is anytime we came up with an innovative invention, we would then go talk to the lawyer, and the lawyer would file a patent, we would get that patent, and they would put it in their patent portfolio of thousands of other patents, and they would just wait. And the way we talked about it internally, which we weren't supposed to at all, but I can now that I'm a decade plus out, is you don't talk about patents, you don't read patents, but if there's ever a war, there's mutually assured destruction amongst all the corporate entities. So they all get together and they agree that they're not going to enforce their patents against each other. But that doesn't mean they're not going to enforce their patents against other people, right? So the patent really has become the way these big companies guard and enforce their control of the market. It's just another layer of monopoly. Meanwhile, you have small vendors like the people who did the oxygen sensor in the watch, who are just blatantly, their patent is being blatantly violated by a company that knows they're violating the patent, could have paid for it, could have even bought the whole company wholesale, and instead decides to try to run them out of business, because that is the way these monopolies run their businesses. They don't run them like small businesses or medium businesses. These are trillion-dollar, country-sized companies protecting their own interests. And yes, the interests of the shareholders, but I think a few $1 trillion is a good return on investment for these shareholders.
Let me shift the conversation a little bit. We've been talking about innovation and the threat to small businesses working in that space and to what consumers are able to get. Let's shift over to price. The price that consumers face, of course, it's a big issue right now. We're in an election and inflation, and prices are our front page story. How does the story about the control over the app gatekeeping impact price? Sherman, do you want to start us off?
Well, I'd start by asking if you had a stakeholder in your company that had 30% of your company, right? And that's essentially if you're selling an app, that's what Apple is. They're a shareholder in your company that has 30% of your company. And they're making decisions about your organization that you have no power over. So immediately you have at least a neutral, but maybe a hostile party that's participating in it. But in terms of price, you have to think, okay, my price plus 30%. So somebody earlier said, how can you run a business where 30% of the margin gets sucked out of the business? And I can't think of another industry aside from maybe a business that has a building, you know, where you're paying astronomical rent, where that much of the revenue is getting pulled out of the business. And of course, it's for participating in a utility or participating in an app store, but at the same time, 30% of that's gone. And so as a small business owner, I have to immediately say, where do my costs live? And if I was selling my app, which I chose not to avoid this problem, I would have to say, okay, well, now I have to price it a little bit more because there's 30%.
So let me just put this question directly, Wade, to you. If there was a public utility, do you think the prices for a lot of these products would go down?
They would. And remember, we went from buying app or getting it free, getting an in-app purchase, and then we went to you can buy some tokens and other things, right? Apple controlled that, so the reality is I might be able to play my fun little game for $4 for that day. I could price it and say it's a per day fee. I don't get that luxury in, let's say, Apple, because it's going to have to be under these standards that they define. And I think what you've seen historically is early on when people put apps out, you're trying to make money off of $3.99, $4.99. Consumers got mad because Apple established this 99-cent download for an iTunes it should be a 99-cent app. Well, development and music is very, very different. And then the reality is you wanted to make money, whether that's a subscription, right, or other services. You just didn't have the luxury because they decided how you were going to define that. And, oh, by the way, you're going to pay 30% of it, which does make it hard because I have no innovation now on how to drop. Now, I eventually did that I charge a subscription service to service, but then Apple made it harder. And then the other thing is we start to talk about ads, right? Make money off advertising. Well, the two biggest controllers, and Google owns that business. And I know because I had tried to put other ad platforms in, and it got pretty complicated, and Apple tried to get into that space. So, again, big players restricting you to have those opportunities, and that becomes a challenge.
And of course, with Google, they own 90% or more of the online searching. So, and there's a lot of manipulation of the formulas to what gets placed higher. Paul, you look eager.
Yeah, I am. I mean, think about where Google comes from, right? It's an incredible search engine. And if you were to ask, you get Sergey Brin and Larry Page to come from their islands, wherever they are right now, and they'd say, we do get a lot for it because it's that much better. Because it's that much better than whatever it was, Lycos, or name whatever the search engine was for it. And so they deserve a return on their investment. And sometimes they get it wrong. And if you don't believe me, let's open a bottle of New Coke, or let's get our Newtons out, right? There are lots of eggs that get laid by great companies for that. I think of the experience of Apple with ebooks and literally charging high prices for this from the standpoint of what is now an established market. But when they did it, people were still thinking about going to Barnes & Noble to get something that's paper. So innovators take chances. There are first mover advantages. The question, I think, the valuable thing is, when do we decide that the first mover and the pioneering is over with and we've got a city with policemen, and what can we do about it with regard to some of the antitrust innovations that are being proposed by Senator Klobuchar?
Do you think we're at that point?
If I go back, from my standpoint, I'm not a specialist in the field, I turn around and say, boy, there's some things I do right now that I would have never thought of 10 years ago. They're established for it. But I'm not sitting there, out in Palo Alto. I'm not sitting out there in Mountain View. I'm not sitting there where the next generation of search engine or other types of innovations that we don't even know about yet. They're there. They're there.
So let's go to the there part. One of the warnings coming from the companies and others is that if we open up the app platforms and open up Google, that it's going to make malware and malicious apps and there are other kinds of cyber vulnerabilities that are out there more likely. Do we need Apple and Amazon and Google as the kind of cop on the street? Dustin?
No.
Yeah, no. There's done. We think about your Windows PC, right? Most of us have access to a Windows PC, if not at home, at work. Microsoft does a very credible job, especially these days, of protecting that platform from threat. And there's no reason Apple and Google couldn't do the same. These are good engineers with solid platforms. They control the code that you use to build the applications on their platform, and that isn't going to change. right? And so they can build the consumer protections directly into the platform. Will there be bad actors? Yes. There are already bad actors, but we don't need one or two companies deciding that my perfectly reasonable startup is a bad actor based on a whim that they have, right? The market can decide who the bad actors are. The platform people, like you talk about markets, people being able to have choice, you can choose a platform that's more or less secure. And the key is when we open these platforms up, I as a consumer will be able to say, I'm going to go and find this thing, I'm going to vet it myself, I'm going to buy it and put it on my device, and I'm going to live with the consequences of that. Right now, you have to go through the App Store, and you have to talk directly as a consumer with Apple and say, Apple, show me the things that you're allowing me to see, right? Imagine how the internet would be and how our current innovation would be if every time you logged in, every website you visited, every company that got started had to go through one entity that needed to make a profit with a particular point of view about what you saw, how you access the internet, how you talk to other people. That's true of your phone. That is absolutely what happens on your phone, and when you don't like it, you open up the web browser, and I think they would love to get rid of that if they could.
Sherman, you'd like to jump in?
I can answer your question now about consumers. It hit me as you were saying this, that's actually happening with Google right now, right? What's the number one fight in Google? It's getting to the top page of search results. So we do have a company that is telling us, a small business, what a consumer can and can't see. As a small business owner, as someone who's created a product, one of my biggest fights is getting attention. And so you've created something that's innovative. Now you've got to pay Google to get to the top of that. You have to pay Apple to get into their app store. I mean, there's all these fees that get you into this attention economy. And when I think about what you're talking about, like, should we close? Should it be so closed? I'm trying to think of a parable that says, what if all of the news had to go through a source and then Apple all of a sudden said, actually, I don't like that story anymore. Right? They can restrict a news app. Now we're stepping out of commerce and stepping into discourse. Right? What happens when Apple decides they don't like the news story, so it gets downranked in their article, or Google does? We have an example of this right now with Twitter, or whatever you call it now, X, right? Like, he doesn't like a story, so it gets downranked. He likes a story, so it gets upranked. Now imagine that's on every single phone. Half of the country owns an iPhone, and a lot of those people are kids, and that narrative is going to them. So I think when you asked me the question about consumers, it took me a second to kind of ratchet up to this moment when you said, we don't need these people controlling that at the message level.
Wade, I want to just put this question to you because you're a smart guy. You've been very successful despite everything. And you certainly know people out there who you think, good God, I hope that stuff doesn't get to market. It would have so many flaws, but also it would be a trap door to the evildoers.
And again, I would say I have no problem with Apple or any place having a process of approval. Okay, there does need to be some warrant to that, and if it's their product. But what's interesting that you really look at it is there's no alternative market for a consumer to have a choice, because in reality you don't own your phone, because you can't determine what apps are on there unless it goes through that store. So you really don't own it. You're kind of basically renting it from that perspective, right? I can appreciate if they said, if you choose to grab apps out of the store or do something outside of, then we don't warranty it, right? Today I have a car. I can add things to my vehicle, right? GM, for that matter, or any other provider, Ford, doesn't restrict me. It might be non-warranty, but then I did it at my risk, right? Whether I wanted to improve the gas mileage or do whatever. I think that's the biggest challenge that we have is I have no problem with Apple being innovative, being ahead, and for that matter, even Google. Because I'd argue and say, we can go to other browsers, or we can go to other social networks for that matter. But there is no way to get out of the fact that I have to submit it to a store without, breaking my phone. Well, the average consumer can't do that. They don't know how, right? No different than the old battery incident Apple happened. I couldn't change my own battery if it got bad unless I did it, which we know the outcome of that.
Paul, we've got 3 very talented software developers here. And, just good social scientists, we know we don't generalize from an N of 3. And I noticed there was a posting by Mark Jameson, who's at American Enterprise Institute, and he said that actually a number of financial indicators and trends suggest that third-party app developers are not struggling in the current environment. How typical, or, I mean, is this a central tendency, or are we kind of looking at, kind of the people who are successful but also smart enough to see the flaws?
So I guess you're saying, are our three colleagues here like farmers who are always complaining that prices are never high enough and interest rates are never low enough on this? I think it's fair to say, Larry, that there's plenty of innovation going on. What I think I hear from our colleagues who actually know the business is it's censored. There's so much we don't see that's ready to explode. And in many ways, that's what this country has been all about. I was going to say, at the dawn of the personal computer age, there were two very viable models for going forward. IBM said open architecture. They didn't really know much other than marketing, so they let it out. Apple said it's all going to be ours. Now, IBM's still in the computer business, but I think it's dare to say that Apple has stuck with us over the decades because it's worked for them. I believe that this is their approach, which has been, to stonewall some of that censored apps, is more out of fear than it is greed. They don't know what it's like to be working in a different age that's more interactive, that's more about contracting, it's more about marketing than it is necessarily only about making their stuff.
I'm curious, we'll just go down the line here. You've talked about the hardship, the barriers, the abuse that you've taken. Are you still in business? Are you making money, Wade?
I did 3 exits, so I'm a benefactor. Don't get me wrong. I loved the iPhone from that perspective because it changed the mindset. But I will tell you, you're right. I had to get really innovative. And the way is I really had to own a vertical, and it became more of a subscription service on the back door with large companies.
So you became quite affluent through this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Sherman, brag.
I can't brag. I am just getting started. And so for me, the scenario is a little bit different. I need the app stores to be there. I need people to have mobile phones because, like I said, they're a prosthetic for the thing that I do. I offer accessibility in exhibits. And so I need people to have a phone and walk into an art museum. So the scenario for me is a little bit different. If Apple or Google says, hey, we like that idea. We'd like to put that on, we'd like to incorporate, we'd like to Sherlock that, I think is the term. We'd like to put that on our device. That immediately destroys my business, and half of my market can't use it anymore. So for me, it's different. I need these to be there, and then I need to be able to operate independently within them.
And are you able to do that?
Well, I have a second job right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not making a ton of money on this, but I'm able right now to operate independently. But with a caveat, because of Apple's restrictions, my customers have to use an Android phone to program my product.
Okay.
So not as well as I'd like.
So Dustin, we've got a situation where Wade is successful businessman, Sherman is the striving entrepreneur. Where do you fit in?
We help other people build and maintain their businesses. So I can tell you, yeah, we worked with Shipped. There's plenty of successful people. I know dozens of startups that have failed in the App Store space. And I can certainly tell you it's not helping that it probably costs, on average, $30,000 to $50,000 over the life cycle of an app going to 1.0 to deal with some of these restrictions. So imagine you were starting something new and you had to go get $100,000+ to build it, and half of that was allocated to a team like mine, just basically kowtowing to Apple and dealing with all the App Store restrictions. And it's not just the money, right? We did an app with Health Partners, a COVID app, and it was a nonprofit app that we built pro bono with them. And Apple basically and Google basically said, we're not going to release that because we're doing our own thing, which took 6 more months. We worked with the Minnesota Department of Health, Regents Hospital, and the U of M, and they all basically said, no, we're not going to make this successful. Even though we were having data, we saw data in our early pilots that would have been medically useful to save lives. And yet we had two companies that basically said, we don't want to play ball because we think we know better about how this is going to play out.
And that actually comes back to a question we were talking about earlier about what are you missing? What don't you see? But I want to come to this question that I was raising just now about success. Because there are all the barriers, there's there's the cost, there's the missed opportunity for innovation. But it sounds like your business has done very well.
Yeah, we've done quite well, and I mean, we're pro services, so we help other people build and maintain their businesses. And so if one of my clients fails because Apple sat on them, I still succeed because I move on to the next client. But how much innovation have we been stifling, right? I think the success of our clients and the whole market is in spite of the things that they're doing, not because of the things they're doing. They happen to have a monopoly on the mobile phone, which is one of the 3 or 4 great inventions in modern technology history. And because of the wealth that created, businesses can succeed despite the harsh environment. But that might change, and for businesses where the environment is just a little less sweet, you never even hear about them.
I want to ask you, a lot of this conversation has been, Western-oriented. It's been about the U.S., sometimes about Europe. Of course, there's a lot of dynamism in Asia and other parts of the world. When you kind of look at the global scene, is Apple and Google and Amazon, are they the titans that we seem to be assuming?
Absolutely. They dominate the world stage. There's no hidden competition somewhere in China that's going to bring us a new phone.
But doesn't it invert? If I remember correct, in the U.S., iPhones tend to have a higher market share, and then in the rest of the world, it's Android.
I believe so, yes. Yeah, based on our data. But the thing is, when you have a company the size of Apple that has, I don't know, their market cap's what, $3 trillion? That's a country operating on a global stage at a country level. And so they can influence even economies like China and Taiwan and other places where the competitors would exist. Apple can go in and buy entire factories, right? And so they're operating at a macroeconomic scale that allows them to have control over an entire planet of economy.
Yeah, my understanding is that in China, they've put up some pretty strong protections, and they're well on their way to developing a Chinese alternative. But in any case, I want to shift to another question because we're going to run out of time soon. Paul, Senator Klobuchar talked about level playing field. And as a former football player, I know what a level playing field is in that context. Does that really have much relevance to this world? Level playing field? What does that mean?
Well, I think it means that right now the terrain looks more like the Rocky Mountains than it does like the Great Plains. So what can we do to at least make it a little bit less, more traversable? And I think that's where we come to actually 3 proposed acts that the Senator has. One is the Apps Online Act, and another is the Online Market Act. And I think while they have differences, one's more specifically for apps and app stores, on the online marketing is more general, they do, I think that what's similar about them is they do this. They attack the kind of self-preferencing of the proprietary innovations in apps and the App Act, and more broadly, the products that are produced in the Online Market Act. And that's back to what I think is the right light-handed approach to this. If the antitrust aim is to bust them all up, burn it all down, and start all over, I don't think that's the way things ought to work. Again, that's a Standard Oil story, and it's not the way we should be running.
Do you hear Senator Klobuchar saying that?
No, I don't think so.
I think she's clearly, and the bipartisanship tells you that as well.
Right. That's why I think with these 2 acts, and frankly another one, an anti-collusion act, it's a story really around issues of using third parties, often platforms, to facilitate cooperative price fixing and the like. I think all 3 of those are really there to just change, I'll mix my metaphors now, change the bargaining power and provide for a kind of bargaining with these players so that in their enlightened self-interest, they make these markets contestable. Now, our 3 colleagues, maybe they're going to decide that they can outspend you until the end of it because they've got market capitalization like, I guess it's a lot like France, the size of the GDP. But there are other big players right here. United Health Group has revenues the size of the GDP of Morocco. And one of the areas of great innovation is in apps for healthcare, as you were just describing, Dustin. Now, if United Health Group comes and gets involved in both the enforcement and then this bargaining, I suspect that Google and Apple are going to spend a little more time working with them.
We're pretty much out of time, but I don't want to bring us to a close without giving each of you an opportunity to take a minute. And the question I have really is, when you listen to Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, and the light touch, as Paul put it, that she's bringing to bringing some sort of competition back into the app platforms. Are you hopeful about the future? Do you see innovation, economic growth, consumer opportunities, or are you deeply concerned? Dustin, you want to start us?
It's a mix, I think. I'm hopeful because technology has always been, in my entire lifetime, a way that it has democratized marketplaces. It has created a nearly unprecedented amount of opportunity for humanity. And I have faith in the technology and the people who can be good shepherds. As long as we have, like you said, good protections from the government, right? We need the government to step in. And I'm not talking about breaking these companies up, right? But are there light touch, reasonable approaches that allow the shareholders of Apple to continue to make their money while we can simultaneously take advantage of their innovation, and they get paid a little bit for it, but they don't have the kind of stranglehold of the market? I do think it is inevitable that those platforms open up, or they'll get snowed under, because even a company the size of Apple can't continue this kind of control forever.
Sherman?
I am hopeful. My father used to say, if you shine a light on something, it's going to get better, and I believe in that. And you talked about, it's okay to have guides. It's okay to have rules as long as we're all playing by the same rules, right? It's okay to have restrictions as long as those restrictions don't create undue pressure, undue competition. It's okay to have multiple app stores, as Android has proven. So I'm hopeful because I agree with you. I think that the market is going to push and push and push until we get into a little bit more openness. And that openness doesn't necessarily need the government to step in and say, this is how you will do it. But it does need somebody to step in and say, we're watching. And what other bipartisan bills have you heard about recently? So the fact that this is bipartisan to me, and you said this, means that it's probably leaning in a meaningful direction.
Wade, last word.
I think in reality, in the app world, we're 10 years late to the prom. I mean, I sold my last company in 2016, and I can tell you it's absolutely changed. And I think the app space is actually going to change. Folks, we're talking about AI. We're talking about some other stuff that's a big conversation. So the legislators can go and do what they're going to do, and I'm like, man, that would have been great 15 years ago, because it would have made a real factor. So it's like, cool, market. Maybe they didn't understand it back then, right? But I do know this, from an AI perspective, we should get on the forefront and understand that, because that's going to change the game. And if somebody locks that up, it's going to be a little tougher. So.
Okay, so put this on your calendar. We'll be back here, in 10 years? Thank you very much, this terrific panel. Please give them a warm welcome. Thanks.